Morning, everyone. Welcome to our second session of this morning's ESG virtual event. My name is Dave Leafort. I'm Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week, and thank you all for joining us. This panel is on trends and best practices for ESG reporting and disclosures. So I guess in summary, we've seen ESG become a priority with shareholders, a priority with regulators, and a priority with corporations as well. So as compliance practitioners, what's your role in this? And that's where we're going to start our discussion today. Before we get to that discussion, I want to introduce our panelists. So first, we have MJ Privyk, Head of ESG Innovation and Customer Success at Novisto. MJ has nearly 30 years of experience in capital markets, namely as financial analyst of small and mid-cap companies, Director of Investor Relations, and as an ESG advisor to companies and investors. She's also a member of CFA Montreal's ESG Committee, of CPA Canada's Value Creation Working Group, of the Enterprise Data Management Council's ESG Working Group, and leader of the Quebec SASB FSA Credential Group. So welcome, MJ. Next, we have Brad Merkin, Managing Director for the Berkeley Research Group. Brad is a former regulator, a former Chief Compliance Officer, and outside counsel to global financial institutions, and a technology compliance expert. With more than a decade of experience with cyber and information security programs, Brad is an expert in shrinking attack surfaces for both global enterprises and small to medium-sized businesses. As a senior regulator, Brad helped lead some of FINRA's highest priority matters against member firms for alleged violations of FINRA and SEC rules. Lastly, on today's panel, we have Linda Smith, Chief Compliance Officer and Regulatory Counsel for Fiera Capital. Linda is responsible for oversight, management, and implementation of Fiera's U.S. division compliance policies and procedures. She brings more than 20 years of legal experience with expertise in U.S. securities laws. Previously, she was Senior Principal Consultant for ACA Compliance Group, providing regulatory advice to leading investment advisors, including hedge funds and private equity fund managers. So, with all of that out of the way, that was a mouthful, I apologize. I want to get right to the discussion here. First off, welcome panelists. We are very glad to have you here today. And I want to hand things off to MJ to kick things off.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to kick off your two-day conference on a very important topic. And I feel a little bit privileged to be here in the morning to help set the table with some ground level information for you. So let's just jump right in with the first item of business. And what are we talking about when we're talking about ESG issues? And essentially, ESG issues are business issues. ESG is an umbrella term that represents or encompasses a number of different issues that are either in the environmental, social, or governance categories. But to a large extent, when we talk about them in the context of companies, they're business issues. And so they're not really new in terms of what companies need to manage in order to run their business properly and profitably over the long term. What is new is the growing focus on these issues on the part of stakeholders, including investors, customers, employees, and also in terms of disclosure obligations. The demand for ESG information is growing. That information needs to be decision useful because different stakeholders, as I just mentioned, are looking at these issues in making their decisions, and those decisions do influence the business activities. So whether it's investors deciding whether or not to invest in a company or at what price, whether it's bankers, whether or not to lend to companies and at what rates and under what covenants, insurance companies looking at these issues in order to determine whether or not to insure activities, and again, at what rate, but also customers or large consumers and choosing the products, and customers if companies happen to be part of a supply chain, though large customers are increasingly looking at managing environmental social governance issues in their supply chains. and also employees. Increasingly, with younger generations, employees are looking to work for companies that are behaving responsibly and managing their ESG issues. This information, like I mentioned, to be decision useful information, it needs to be consistent, comparable, and reliable. And we are increasingly hearing voices of very prominent people in financial circles, in particular, calling for corporate disclosures to be available, consistent, comparable, and reliable. How does that happen? What needs to happen for that information to be decision useful? Well, to be available, information needs to be, or disclosures rather, need to be regulated. To be comparable, they need to be standardized. To be reliable, they need to be externally assured. And to make all of that easier, they need to be digitized. And what we're seeing in the marketplace is exactly that. So whether it's from organizations like the SEC, the IFRS, IOSCO, the European Commission, this is exactly what we're seeing in the corporate disclosure landscape right now. The ESG, or sustainability reporting ecosystem, is what I call effervescent. And so here to highlight just a few of the things that we're seeing and that we're following closely, perhaps most important for any company in the U.S. market is the work of the SEC, the creation of an ESG Task Force, and the work that they're doing to revisit and modify their ESG disclosure requirements, starting with climate, but also other ESG issues. And human capital is one issue that there's been movement on recently, and that we can expect more changes on. Elsewhere in the world, in Europe in particular, there's a lot of work being done by the European Commission. There were already some regulations in place, but there are new regulations upcoming that are going to be concerning many, many more, if not all, companies that are going to be calling for disclosures to be regulated, standardized, and externally audited, as well as digitized. And you're also seeing some regulatory changes in jurisdictions such as the New Zealand, the UK, and more recently Switzerland, that are mandating climate-related disclosures in alignment with the TCFD recommendations. In terms of standardizations, we're seeing the work of the IFRS creating an International Sustainability Standards Board. They're expecting to announce that later on this year. We're also seeing EFRAG in Europe that was mandated to come up with European corporate disclosure standards. And we've had a number of bodies, disclosure standards and frameworks that are working together, actually, and that have already come up with a prototype for climate-related financial disclosures. And as a matter of fact, last week, EFRAG published its prototype for a climate-related disclosure standard, and there are a lot of commonalities in there. So we're starting to get a clearer picture of what regulated disclosures are going to look like. The last two items I'm just going to touch on very quickly. Expect to hear more and more about impact. A lot about the changes in regulations have to do with the concept of double materiality. So looking not only at the issues that can impact a company's operations, risk profile, prospects, but also the issues that a company can affect in the conduct of its business. And as I mentioned and briefly touched on, the whole concept of digitization, which is actually part of a broader trend in digitizing business practices, but it will also be affecting corporate sustainability disclosures. Very, very quickly, also in terms of main reporting schemes, currently just some of them you may already be familiar with, some of them may be new to you, but I'm sure this is not the last time you're going to hear about them in the next few days and even weeks and months. Just to keep in mind, there are essentially 4 corporate issuers. There are essentially 2 disclosure standards, those being SASB and GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. There are 2 well-known frameworks, one of them being the Integrated Reporting Framework from the International Integrated Reporting Council and the TCFD recommendations, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And there are two disclosure platforms, those being CDP and S&P Global, those platforms being essentially questionnaires that are sent to companies, that companies provide information onto a platform that is then leveraged by different stakeholders, most importantly, investors. And perhaps throughout our conversation today, we can touch on some of the convergence or the similarities between corporate reporting or disclosure obligations and investor disclosure obligations. I will leave it at that for now and turn it over to Brad.
Good morning, and thanks very much, MJ. In ESG regulation and reporting and disclosures, 2021 has been and will continue to be the year of change, There has been a discussion that has been ongoing in the ESG community that has been joined in by some governments, especially outside of the U.S., especially, say, in the EU. The U.S. is now part of that and is catching up rapidly. The Trump administration was very active on ESG, but active as an anti-ESG force. That changed almost immediately on January 20th when the Biden administration came in. And you have a sea change, and ESG investing is now not merely an area of regulatory and enforcement interest, but it may be the greatest area of regulatory and enforcement interest, at least with respect to the SEC and certain other federal regulators. This is most apparent from looking at the SEC, but it's not exclusive to the actions of the SEC. So I'm going to start off with slide 2. I can push that out to you. And if you're seeing that, this deals with the SEC's April 9th risk alert. It came from what used to be called OC, which is now the Division of Examinations. If you haven't read this and you're involved professionally in ESG or sustainability, I recommend that you read it line by line. It's 6.5 pages, and reread it. They start off with ineffective practices, as regulators often do. It's not what you can do right, but here's what they're seeing is done wrong. This is a result of examinations of their observations of reviews over the years, SEC reviews of registered investment advisors, investment companies such as private funds, offering ESG products and services. So I have at the beginning here various points on what's misleading, what's inadequate, what's inconsistent, and then the last point on ineffective practices, compliance staff and compliance staff failings. If you take a look at the next slide, this is a shorter slide, and this deals with what's being done right, at least in the SEC's view. What's effective? And then the last of those 3 points is personnel knowledgeable about firms' ESG practices. Be in that category. If you're in compliance, if you're in operations, if you're in legal, if you're in investing, be knowledgeable about your firm's ESG practices, what's being done consistently, what's being done inconsistently, where is the hole as opposed to the donut, what's missing. Think about things like that. The next slide. This has become a more important issue for directors. If you take a look at one of the most interesting and newsworthy issues of the last few months was the activities by a small activist investor called Engine Number One, which placed 3 of the 12 directors of ExxonMobil, having its directors slate become 3 of the 12 for ExxonMobil. Engine Number One is tiny. Engine Number One was just an activist investor, but they got BlackRock and they got others to be on board, including 2 of the world's largest pension funds. Armed with that, they now have greater board competence, at least in its view, as an activist investor, And those risk disclosures, that's the last point on ESG obligations here, that the SEC and former acting chair and now Commissioner Allison Heron-Lee talked about in this the speech that is in the slide, referred to in the slide. Those risk disclosures can't be more important, and that's something that everyone here who focuses on regulation needs to be well aware of. In enforcement, which more than anything else makes people focus on these issues, the threat of enforcement, the SEC set up a climate and ESG task force. That was announced on March 4th, 2021, and that was right after the SEC's examination priorities had come out the previous day. The SEC has their annual examination priorities. The lead, right under examination priorities in the title, was enhanced focus on climate-related risks. That couldn't be clearer. This is an area of huge focus, and they don't put 22 members of the SEC on a task force unless they expect to produce something. They expect enforcement coming out of this. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the activities there, but in the interest of time, I'll just go to the next slide and pushing that out. The ESG recommendations that followed 3 months later followed that task force coming out. There's an asset management advisory committee. You don't usually get committees like that having the SEC chair and 2 commissioners appear or issue public statements in a meeting of an advisory committee. But on ESG, you do. So that has asset management industry members, and they're looking at issuer disclosures, investment product disclosures, and measuring performance. One of the things that MJ was talking about on standardization, they're talking about how this is an area that we need to take a closer look at, to be clear, to be consistent with everyone. And it's going to be, and it's material. Material ESG matters matter. And it used to be that these were just financial considerations. Now there are non-financial considerations that affect the financial. That's material in the SEC's view. So here's a quick practice pointer, and that is that if you're not that familiar with ESG, and maybe you consider it to be novel, a little bit daunting because it is novel and you haven't worked with it, do it in reverse. Think about GSE. You know governance. Governance is not that distinct from what many of you do every day and have been doing for years. Use that knowledge that you have, because after all, weak governance practices, such as what you see with Bernie Madoff, or you see with Tyco, or you saw with Tyco or Enron, or Wells Fargo on their accounts that didn't exist more recently. All of that is known to you. Fraud is fraud. Weak practices are weak practices. The social is more emotional and is newer, but you can deal with things such as what SEC Chair Gary Gensler talked about in July, such as skills and development training or workforce demographics, such as diversity and health and safety. Many of you deal with these issues all the time. They just probably haven't been in disclosures. Now they need to be in disclosures. And then you go to the environmental, probably the most contentious and emotional area you may find. But if you have footing in G and S, that may not be that daunting for you. The SEC has been looking into the ESG practices very, very vigorously. So in March, they started sending out possibly the most comprehensive set of document requests that many funds have seen in quite a long time. About 90 questions, 16 of them focused on compliance. 90 questions, a 4-year examination period. That's unusually long for the SEC. They're not doing this because they just want paper. They're not doing this because they want large files coming in. They're doing this because you should expect enforcement. We can talk more about this, but there's so much going on here. And thank all of you for coming this morning.
Thank you, Brad.
I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thank you. So before we turn things over to Linda, I just want to point out that, my biggest takeaway from some of the things you said is that the fact that the SEC is truly getting serious about this. I think what you said about you don't commit 22 people to doing something without actually doing something. So I think that fact alone is expect some action from the SEC. So thank you, Brad. And now with that, I'll turn things over to Linda. Linda, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was on mute. I was about to say, delighted to be here today as part of this panel. Thank you for having me. And thank you, MJ and Brad, for all these insights. I, as you said, head of the compliance team of Fiera Capital USA. I want to start by telling you a few things about Fiera Capital and our involvement in the ESG movement, which started very early on. Fiera Capital USA is the a U.S. subsidiary of Fiera Capital Corporation, a Canadian money manager, which is headquartered in Montreal and publicly traded in the Toronto Stock Exchange. We are a diversified money manager. We have mutual funds, private funds, and separately managed accounts. Several of those are with large institutional investors. And our parent company, Fiera Capital Corporation, was involved in the ESG movement very early on. We became one of the early signatories of the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, which MJ mentioned. We are official supporters of SASB, and we very recently joined the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is a group of international asset managers that are committed to manage their portfolios to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and be carbon neutral by 2050. So, again, my company is, in all these different respects, is very involved with the ESG movement. Both Brad and MJ mentioned the importance of accurate disclosures and the different SEC initiatives and how we may very well see soon enforcement actions in this area. And I think that there is, recent developments that really demonstrate this trend. I don't know if the audience followed the recent investigation of DWS, the asset management, German asset management firm owned by Deutsche Bank, which is currently being investigated by the SEC and the German regulator for inaccurate and misleading disclosures on their ESG and sustainability investing practices. And maybe this is the first case that we will see out of the new SEC task force with the 22 SEC members that are part of this task force. I don't know if MJ and Brad view it differently, but I think it's just the beginning. And it is important again to stress the importance of accurate and not misleading disclosures, but this is not an easy task to undertake for the compliance team. And this is primarily because, first of all, disclosures are everywhere within a firm. They're produced by many different groups, and this content is not always visible by the compliance team. So there are disclosures, corporate disclosures in annual reports. There are disclosures in sustainability reports, which are optional. There are disclosures given to existing investors through DDQs and compliance questionnaires. There are disclosures to both existing and prospective investors through all kinds of marketing materials, but also disclosures posted on databases, such as investment disclosures, to offering documents for the private funds, PPMs, disclosures to mutual boards and private fund boards, disclosures found in regulatory filings such as the ADV Part 2A, where an advisor basically discloses their investment strategies and the risks involved with those strategies. And finally, disclosures found on all kinds of reports to frameworks such as the UNPRI, which reports are sometimes they're not public, but sometimes they're given to investors upon request, and that way they become marketing materials and representations to investors, although, as I said, they're not primarily public. So the first task of the compliance team, which again is not an easy task, is to identify the source of those disclosures and the location of those disclosures. And I think the compliance team may do so by engaging as much as they can with the investment teams and all the content creators, the ESG-related content creators within the firm. They could be the investor relations team or as I said, the investment team themselves, to participate in mutual fund board meetings, in the private fund board meetings, so as to be up to date with all the disclosures produced within the firm. And so I think we see regarding, again, investor disclosures, we see recently two major trends. First of all, that we are money managers, and initially we used to get requests for disclosures about our investment practices just as they related to our investment process. Now we get a number of requests to explain from investors, not from shareholders, to explain our ESG practices as corporate citizens. For instance, as organizations, for instance, our diversity and inclusion initiatives. This was not the case before. Another trend that we see is that the questions from investors tend to be very granular and very detailed. In the beginning of the movement, we used to get questions like, how do you take into consideration ESG factors into your investment process? Now, the questions are way more detailed. So, for instance, we are asked, do you use third-party research providers in your investment process? Do you have an internal scoring system, or do you use external ESG score rating agencies, or do you use both? If you have your own internal scoring system, do all the factors count the same? How often do you review and you evaluate your score? Do you use frameworks such as SASB? If you engage with issuers to inform your investment process or your proxy voting, how do you engage them? How frequently do you engage them? What is your purpose? Is it to change corporate behavior? Is it just to be informed? So very, very detailed questions. The danger with these detailed questions is oftentimes, so the responses then become crucial. And oftentimes the danger is not in disclosures that are exaggerated, responses that are exaggerated or are not substantiated, or they're false. Oftentimes, in my view, the risk is in providing disclosures that are not sufficient, that you somehow under-disclose, that you didn't disclose all material facts. And there's a lot of room, there's great room for judgment here of what you, not only what you disclosed, but what you should have disclosed. And it depends how aggressive the SEC will become in finding disclosures sufficient or insufficient. Finally, another trend that we see is investors sometimes take on, their due diligence more into their own hands, and they run their own, basically, evaluation of their portfolio. And they use their own risk providers, their own rating agencies, and they do not only depend on the rating agencies and the internal scoring methodologies of the advisor, of the money manager themselves. And another, I guess the final thing that I wanted to say about disclosures is that the proliferation of the different frameworks that managers join, such as the United Nations Principle of Responsible Investment or the Net Zero Asset Managers, create new obligations because the SEC will ask to see your reports to those frameworks. Even if those are not disclosed to investors, per se, like the reports are not submitted to investors, the mere fact that you told investors that you are a member of those associations will lead the SEC to examine your internal work, and they will ask, for reports to be submitted, the reports that you submitted to those organizations to be submitted to them as well, to ensure that you're truly doing the work required. And so these frameworks now have two sets of eyes, the organization itself, but also the SEC. And I think that from that perspective, asset managers or everyone who's joining those organizations should make sure that they are appropriate and that can do all the internal work required. And even finally, even if the internal policies and procedures are equally important, because even if they're not disclosed to investors, because the SEC will hold you accountable. So Brad mentioned that part of the effective practices is to have detailed and well-documented policies and procedures. But there's a risk there too, because if you have too much detail in your policies and procedures, you may not be able to fully monitor and implement it. So the right level of detail is very important.
Great. Thank you very much.
That's all I have to say. Yeah.
We appreciate it. Thank you, Linda. So before we move on to the discussion portion of our presentation today, I just want to remind all attendees to, before we finish up today, we probably have about 25 minutes or so left, make sure to answer the CPE questions if you are interested in getting your CPE credits and downloading your certificate. Just wanted to stress that. I forgot to mention that at the outset of the session today. So what we've learned so far from Brad, MJ, and Linda is that a lot of people care about ESG reporting. We know investors care about ESG reporting. We know company stakeholders care about ESG reporting. And we know that regulators care about ESG reporting, all of which points to the fact that what you are disclosing as a corporation needs to be accurate. And so the question then, and I have a poll question to follow, is who should be, what is compliance's responsibility in all of this? And where should responsibility for the accuracy of these disclosures lie? So I'm going to publish a poll question now that asks that very question. Should compliance be assigned primary responsibility for sustainability or ESG disclosures? So I'm hoping that you all can see this now. And before I go to the results, I'm just going to give people a few seconds here to submit the answer to their questions. And then we will move on to the results and then a discussion about those results. So I am going to move on and publish the results to the audience. And okay, it looks like Depends gets the majority, which I guess is fair because it sort of does depend on the circumstances. But notably, the yeses do outnumber the nos. So I will pose this question to, in particular, Brad and MJ. One, what do you think of these results? And does responsibility for ESG reporting, should that fall on compliance, or should it fall elsewhere, such as perhaps legal or perhaps a department on its own? So, when do you want to start the conversation?
Happy to jump in and start the ball rolling, if that's okay.
Great.
So very interesting question and equally interesting results. Not surprising, and actually quite pleased to see that it's more nuanced than a straight yes or no. And I just a couple of additional comments. First of all, there is an added complexity to this conversation we're having this morning because we're talking both about corporate disclosure and about investor disclosure. And while there are many similarities, they are not the same, obviously. But we should underline that when we talk about the SEC is looking at both. It's looking at, beefing up corporate disclosure obligations as well as investor disclosure obligations, in particular with respect to what they say about their sustainability or ESG practices and investment products. The thing about what we're seeing, and I can speak for the corporate perspective on this. ESG or sustainability is a complex thing to embrace and to integrate into company operations because it is multidimensional, and the various E or S or G issues that are material to a company and that the company needs to manage actually sit in very different departments. And so more often than not, the more successful companies are the ones that embrace this multifunctional approach. In other words, via a committee where multiple different departments are represented. The other essential ingredient is also that there is input and there is buy-in and there is guidance at the very highest levels of the organization. In other words, the board and the C-suite. And so maybe to answer that question, it's not so much a question of whether compliance should have responsibility, but should compliance be involved? And so the answer to that question is an absolute resounding yes, but perhaps not try to carry the ball on its own shoulders by itself, because that's quite challenging for any company. And you can have very many different examples of responsibility for reporting, sustainability reporting, living in communications, living in investor relations. I think Linda alluded to that earlier, or living even with the corporate secretary, or eventually perhaps living even in the finance department. So it doesn't really matter that it be in one particular place. It's just that all of these actually need to be involved, including compliance.
I think it's a great point. I think it depends, and the nuanced way that MJ sifted through that, I think, is something everybody should be spending time on, not just for the next 10 or 15 minutes, but for the next 10 or 15 months in your organizations. The responsibility can go to compliance. Compliance, at least in my view, and I think the SEC's view, and I think in the view of almost every regulator, is best placed to do more with knowledge of ESG and reviews of ESG and even ESG oversight. But what does compliance do with it? What does the company do with it? What is if it's an issuer, what is the issuer doing with it? If it's an advisor, what is the advisor doing with it? Does compliance have that budget? Does compliance have the authority? Or is this simply adding to a very, very busy compliance department simply not being adequately equipped to handle that responsibility? And if there are issues, what happens with escalation? the SEC and any regulator will look for evidence of escalation and evidence that what compliance actually does, or what anyone actually does with that review and that oversight, matters to the company. Is there actual change? And there are cases where you can have a regulator looking at metrics to see if there have been 50 different cases of escalation, how many times has there been actual change? Or is it 50 times the compliance raises an issue and 50 times there's nothing done about it? That's not a metric you want to have. Is there a board involved? So is this something that compliance, for example, makes a presentation on to the board of directors, or is there a chief risk officer, someone else doing that? The requests from the SEC in the start of March cover a great deal of territory, from annual reviews, where they'd expect ESG to be part of that annual review, to testing, to exceptions for non-compliance, and also cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is listed by the SEC under compliance and responsibility. So are you going to have those issues being part of compliance's ESG responsibility? There's some overlap with ESG, but there's in some ways that's distinct. But in all cases, you want to have compliance armed, prepared, and equipped to be meaningful and to be able to make that presentation to a regulator that you have taken this seriously, you've documented in a contemporaneous fashion, you've documented consistently, and that you have that evidence that can make the difference for your company, because your credibility with a regulator or any governmental authority is the most important currency you ever have.
I agree, and I wanted to ask Brad and MJ, which departments really have they seen being involved in the oversight of disclosures? Is compliance meant to here just to test a few, or review every single disclosure before it's submitted, and how can they achieve the result? Or who are the groups that the SEC will feel should have been more involved? Is it just the board, or who are the groups that will be assigned with maybe secondary responsibility?
I think that the challenge has been that sustainability reporting has, by and large, been voluntary until now. So unregulated and unstandardized, and it's been a little bit all over the place. And the market hates a void, and so a lot of third-party data providers, rating agencies have come into the market to try to meet that need for information that investors are having. And I think it's important to always have in back of your mind the why this is happening. Why are stakeholders, investors, and first and foremost asking for more decision useful information on these issues? Why are regulators now looking into this? Why is there such a push to standardize disclosures? And so because it was unregulated and unstandardized, it kind of lived in different places, and very often, actually, very separately than what I would call the traditional business functions. So very separately from finance, from risk management, the enterprise risk management processes, from internal audit, very separate from C-suite and from board oversight. It was very rare a few years ago for senior management and the board to see a sustainability report before it came out. It was very much more of a communications exercise than a reporting exercise. So it was it largely was excluded from the traditional, oversight processes, auditing processes, et cetera. I think the fact that compliance is now being called upon to get involved is absolutely related to the fact that the regulations are growing. It is becoming a regulatory obligation now to provide this kind of information to the market, and it has to be done in a very structured way. It is not a communications exercise. It's a disclosure exercise. So I don't know that the SEC is actually going to make a call as to who in what specific department should be responsible. I think that belongs to the company. I would not be surprised to see board and C-suite sign off on sustainability disclosures similar to financial disclosures. It may not be tomorrow morning, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that happening over time.
Well, I think that I think it's a great question and a superb answer from MJ. And MJ used the term unstandardized. I will give a definitive answer on what's going on here. It's unsettled, and the SEC knows it's unsettled. But despite the fact that it's unsettled, and this is moving at such a fast pace, they still expect an awful lot from issuers and advisors, and frankly from investors. And we're talking a lot about the SEC, but let's not forget other regulators, because for financial institutions, the OCC, especially large banks, is the primary regulator, and the SEC and the OCC hasn't been absent here. So they, in July, appointed their first climate change risk officer, and that was to, quote, accelerate the development and adoption of robust climate change risk management practices. So they're looking for risk management to change as a result of this increased effort on climate change. But when we talked about this being unsettled, in March, Allison Lee, who was at that point the acting chair, issued a public statement where she said she had 15 questions on disclosure risk and disclosure rules on climate change, and she asked for public comment. Those 15 questions included probably more than 50 or 60 subparts. So if she's asking 50 or 60 questions on disclosure and how it should be, that's a tacit acknowledgement that this is very unsettled. But on the other hand, to use a phrase from a 1961 Supreme Court case, I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. So the SEC will know it when it sees it, even if it doesn't know what the standard is. The standard will be that if you're misleading and you're misleading investors, and the head of enforcement, Melissa Hodgman, referred to the Fiat Chrysler case, where Fiat Chrysler had been misleading about some internal emissions testing. That was they didn't need to know what the actual, what the detail by detail, grain by grain standard was. They knew that was misleading, so they brought an action in 2016 in the last days of the Obama administration, and that was a $9.5 million fine. You can expect if it's misleading, they will definitely bring an action if they find it. Just make sure they don't find it. Don't be part of that. Don't be part of that problem.
Yeah, I'd add to that, Brad. One of the things you said that I think is probably one of the key takeaways for people today, especially if you're just starting in on this topic, is things are happening fast. The landscape is changing fast, and so it's important to keep abreast of those changes. It's also important to understand exactly what are we talking about, what this is about. It's not a fad. It's not going away. This is a fundamental paradigm shift in how businesses are meant to be managed, and the expectations of stakeholders, capital providers, first among them. I mean, and the fact that the regulations are coming is twofold. There's regulations to increase availability of information, make it compulsory, because there is a lack of availability of decision useful ESG related information right now. The second reason for regulation is to make sure that companies and investors are doing what they're saying. It's the do what you say and say what you do, and making sure that companies are in fact doing what they're saying, and investors the same with respect to sustainability, investment practices, ESG integration. A lot of the key term we're hearing these days is greenwashing, and part of the reason for increasing regulations is to reduce the risk of greenwashing, reduce the probability, the possibility for those investing in those investment products to be misled, or for those investing in those companies to be misled. And I would just, I would not stress enough the fact that this is not separate from business. This is part of business. This is definitely part of governance, definitely part of risk management, and it has everything to do with ultimately the ability of the company to create value.
Oh, sorry, it looks like, Dave, are you on mute?
No, Brad, it's all you. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. I was just going to say that, two notes. One, agreeing with MJ yet again. if you don't believe that this is going to affect your business in a very vital way, once again, take a look at what happened at ExxonMobil. We're now 25% of the directors come from an anti, or let's say pro climate change, anti-carbon based future for ExxonMobil. That is a gigantic change. How they deal with that going forward will be fascinating because it's going to affect an awful lot of companies. One other point, and just to make sure that we don't sound too alarmist, there's been a tidal wave of new ESG regulation and focus, but things may change in Washington in 2 years, and things may really change in Washington in 4 years. So some people may feel that they're going to be able to wait it out, and that there will be an anti-ESG activist agenda that comes to Washington if there's a change in one or both houses of Congress in 2023, and that there may be a huge change if the executive changes, to an anti-ESG agenda starting in January 2025. It's possible people may be able to wait this out. I think if they try to do that, there'll be a lot of pain. Even if activist investors, take on boards of directors in the interim. If the SEC brings actions and people feel that they can wait for the matter to go through the courts and then seek help, if there's a change in Washington, all of that is possible. But this is a rapidly changing landscape. But there's no question whatsoever that the powers that be right now in Washington want change. They want to see it. They want it to be tangible. They want those disclosures to be beefed up. They want them to be consistent. They want them to be accurate. And they don't want to have investors filing complaints or whistleblowers seeking action from federal regulators to help them because issuers and advisors haven't.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I think you nailed it. If you take the approach of taking a wait and see and wait for an administration change or a House or Senate change, I think that might be the biggest risk of all. So before we get to our Q&A portion here, we have about less than 10 minutes left. I wanted to call back to something that MJ said that really resonated with me, and it really boils down to companies saying what you do and doing what you say. So that really, at the end of the day, is really what this boils down to. So I'm going to shift to a couple questions from the audience, and I'm going to just pitch these out here, and if anyone has an answer or an opinion, please share it. So this question is, with respect to investments, does the panel anticipate that a taxonomy similar to that developed in the EU for categorizing sustainable investments will be developed in the United States?
Do you want to start on that one, Linda?
We have not seen signs of that, or I don't know if you disagree or Brad disagrees. Here in the U.S., we have not seen any public statements by the SEC or by the regulators or by, the legislators that they will follow Europe's example in establishing a taxonomy. So,
yep, go ahead.
In my humble opinion, this will not happen anytime soon in the U.S. We will take a different route, I think.
Yeah.
There's that. Sorry, real quick, there's that whole, regulatory centric approach in Europe versus market centric approach in North America, particularly the US, that's at play here. However, to that I would add, and I haven't seen a US based taxonomy from regulators in the US either. Having said that, I would suggest you take a look at the CFA Institute's ESG disclosure standards for investment products, meant to be voluntary standards. Absolutely. It's not a detailed taxonomy, but it does provide a uniform, standardized way for identifying different investment practices and different approaches to characterize different investment products. And it does a really good job, actually. So that could be a good starting point.
Yeah, the U.S. doesn't do standardization well. We have lots of different regulators, lots of different jurisdictions, and I don't think one has to once again take a look at contemporary politics too closely to see that that is the way things typically work. Getting everyone to agree on one thing is probably not going to be in our near future. This is something that I had in one of my slides in terms of lack of standardization. Once again, the SEC's Asset Management Advisory Committee, consisting of 19 asset management industry members, talking about having a lack of standardization may require a call to action. But once again, no one's, I think, getting everyone to agree on what that action should consist of is likely to result in inaction.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad. Well, yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're actually, we've reached our time limit. There is another session after ours, and I know the three of you could talk about this for probably another 2 or 3 hours. So I want to thank you, Linda. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, MJ, for a great discussion. I want to thank our attendees. You probably have about 20 more seconds to finish up your CPE exam and to download your certificate before we shut down the console here. So thank you, everybody, and we hope you stick with us throughout the rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Dave, MJ, Linda, terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.